Mary had always been a picture of health. At 68, she enjoyed a robust life filled with gardening, walking, and spending time with her family. She had never been one to dwell on small inconveniences, brushing off colds and seasonal ailments with a cup of tea and some rest. However, this time was different. It started as a simple irritation in her throat, a dry, scratchy sensation that she thought would pass after a day or two. But as the days turned into weeks, the cough refused to go away. The persistent dry cough began early in the morning, waking Mary from her sleep with a harsh, uncontrollable fit. It was an unsettling sound, one that seemed to resonate deep within her chest. The cough wasn't productive. There was no mucus or phlegm. Instead, it left her throat sore and irritated, and she found herself constantly reaching for a glass of water to soothe the raw feeling. By the end of each day, she was exhausted, her voice hoarse from hours of coughing, and she had to force herself to rest, even though sleep was elusive with the constant disruptions. At first, she wasn't too concerned. After all, she had gone through similar bouts of dry coughs before, usually due to a mild cold or some seasonal allergies. She had always recovered without much trouble. But as the days wore on, she began to notice subtle changes. The cough was not just persistent, it was getting worse. It was starting to interfere with her daily life. Simple activities, like going to the grocery store or having a conversation with her friends, now felt overwhelming. She found herself short of breath, especially after bouts of coughing, and she had to pause frequently to regain control over her breathing. Jim, her husband of 45 years, was the first to notice how much the cough was affecting Mary. Jim had always been a rock in their relationship, ever vigilant and attentive. He noticed that she wasn't her usual self. She was quieter, more withdrawn, and she seemed to tire more easily. As the cough continued without showing any signs of improvement, Jim grew concerned. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Jim gently suggested that Mary should visit the doctor. "Mary, I think we should get this checked out. You've been coughing like this for weeks now, and it's just not normal. You're getting too worn out from it," he said, his voice laced with genuine concern. Mary, ever the optimist, brushed it off. "It's just a cough, Jim. I'm sure it's nothing serious. Probably just some lingering effects of that cold I had last month." She smiled, tried to reassure him, but even as she said it, she knew deep down that something was different this time. Despite her initial reluctance, Jim persisted. He could see the toll it was taking on her. Her once bright energy was dimming, and the constant coughing was making her increasingly irritable. When Mary finally agreed to make an appointment, Jim felt a small sense of relief. They had been through enough together to know when to trust their instincts. The following week, Mary sat in the doctor's office, feeling a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. She had never been one to run to the doctor at the first sign of illness, but this time, something didn't feel right. Dr. Harper, their family physician, was a calm and thoughtful woman in her late 40s who had been seeing Mary and Jim for over 20 years. She knew them well, and her warm demeanor always made Mary feel at ease. Dr. Harper listened attentively as Mary described the symptoms she had been experiencing: the dry, non-productive cough, the fatigue, the shortness of breath, and the general feeling of being unwell. Dr. Harper took notes, nodding thoughtfully. She then asked Mary to take a deep breath and listen to her chest with a stethoscope. The sounds it made were not quite what she expected. There was a slight wheeze, not enough to be alarming, but enough to make her raise an eyebrow. "Mary, I think we should run some tests to get a clearer picture of what's going on," Dr. Harper said after a moment. "It could be something as simple as allergies or a mild infection, but given the duration of your symptoms, I want to rule out other possibilities." "It's better to be thorough," Mary agreed, albeit reluctantly, and a few days later, she returned to the clinic for a series of tests, including a chest X-ray and a pulmonary function test. Jim accompanied her, still worried, but hopeful that it was nothing more than a temporary setback. The results came back within a few days, and Dr. Harper asked Mary and Jim to return to the office to discuss the findings. Sitting across from Dr. Harper, Mary felt a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. Jim's hand was warm in hers, but his grip was slightly tense, betraying his own anxiety. "Mary," Dr. Harper began, her voice steady but serious. "The tests have shown some concerning signs. The X-ray revealed some early changes in your lungs, and your pulmonary function test indicates that your airways are a bit restricted. While it's not conclusive yet, these findings suggest the possibility of chronic lung disease, such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, or even early-stage interstitial lung disease. This could explain why your cough has been persistent and why you've been feeling more fatigued." Mary's heart sank. The words chronic and lung disease hit her like a ton of bricks. She had never imagined something like this could be the cause of her discomfort. She had always been so active and healthy. She had never smoked a cigarette in her life, never had any serious respiratory issues before. How could this be happening to her now? Dr. Harper continued, explaining that while it was still too early to give a definitive diagnosis, the next step was to conduct further tests to understand the full extent of the situation. "I'm going to refer you to a pulmonologist, a specialist in lung diseases," she said. "They will be able to run more detailed tests and determine the best course of action." The next few weeks were filled with appointments, tests, and follow-up visits. Mary learned that her condition was, in fact, early-stage interstitial lung disease, a group of disorders that cause progressive scarring of the lung tissue. Though it was not immediately life-threatening, it was a condition that required ongoing monitoring and treatment. Dr. Harper and the pulmonologist both emphasized the importance of early intervention in managing the disease. The earlier they could address it, the better the prognosis for preserving lung function and quality of life. Mary's initial shock gave way to a deep sense of relief. The constant cough she had been enduring was no longer just an annoying nuisance. It was a warning sign that something was wrong with her lungs. Without the tests and the timely intervention, she could have gone on ignoring the problem, possibly making it worse over time. As the weeks went by, Mary began following the treatment plan laid out by her doctors. She started taking medication to reduce inflammation in her airways, and she was advised to make certain lifestyle changes, including avoiding irritants like secondhand smoke and pollution. She also began attending pulmonary rehabilitation, a program designed to help people with lung conditions improve their breathing and endurance. The dry cough persisted for a while, but it gradually became less frequent and less intense. With each passing week, Mary felt a little stronger, a little more like herself again. She no longer took her health for granted, and she was more vigilant about monitoring her symptoms. Her experience with the persistent cough had taught her an invaluable lesson. Never ignore your body's warning signs, especially as you grow older. What seemed like a minor inconvenience could sometimes be the early indication of something much more serious. Mary's journey wasn't over, but she had learned to face it with a new sense of awareness and gratitude. She had come to appreciate the importance of regular checkups, early diagnosis, and the support of her family in navigating this uncertain time. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sunset and listening to the birds, Mary knew she was taking the right steps to protect her health. And for the first time in weeks, she felt at peace. John had always been a man who took pride in his work, his family, and his ability to handle things on his own. At 75, he had lived a full life, one that had been marked by both triumphs and struggles, but he had always prided himself on his resilience. John's years as a mechanic had shaped him into a practical and no-nonsense individual, someone who didn't dwell on small annoyances. However, this time was different. For the past few months, something had been happening to his body that he couldn't ignore, and it was beginning to worry him. The first time John noticed the change was when he woke up one morning with a persistent cough. It was a wet, chesty cough that he couldn't shake, one that left him feeling drained and uncomfortable. At first, he thought it was just a cold or some seasonal flu. He had lived through dozens of such illnesses over the years, often without taking much time off work. But this time, the cough didn't go away. It lingered, and even though it seemed to get worse in the mornings, it stayed with him throughout the day. His chest felt tight, as if something heavy was pressing down on it, and the cough itself sounded deep and phlegmy. There was always mucus, sometimes thick, sometimes thin, but it never seemed to clear up completely. For a while, John didn't think much of it. He had smoked for most of his life, ever since his teenage years, and he assumed the cough was just a result of the damage his lungs had suffered over the decades. In fact, he had been expecting something like this for years. He had heard about the dangers of smoking, how it could lead to chronic bronchitis, emphysema, or even cancer. In the back of his mind, he feared that his lungs were finally starting to show the consequences of his smoking habit. But even so, he pushed those fears aside. It wasn't the first time he had coughed up mucus, and he figured it was just part of getting older. Days turned into weeks, and the coughing didn't subside. In fact, it seemed to get worse. Every morning, John would wake up with a tight chest and a racking cough that left him gasping for air. He had to spit out the mucus that seemed to accumulate in his lungs overnight. By mid-morning, his energy would start to fade, and he'd find himself feeling short of breath after the simplest of tasks. Climbing stairs, walking to the mailbox, or even talking for extended periods of time left him winded. His once strong body, which had carried him through decades of physical labor, now felt fragile and worn. John's daughter, Emily, had always been a careful and loving person, the kind of daughter who would notice when something wasn't right. When she visited him one Saturday afternoon, she immediately saw that he didn't look like his usual self. His face was pale, and his movements were slower than she remembered. He seemed tired, his eyes sunken, and he was still coughing, a deep, wet sound that echoed throughout the house. "Dad, you don't look so good," Emily said, sitting down next to him on the couch. "Are you feeling okay?" "I'm fine," John replied, waving her off. "Just a bit of cough, that's all. I've had worse." Emily didn't buy it. She had known her father long enough to know when something was off. "Dad, this isn't just a regular cough. You've been like this for weeks now. You need to see a doctor." John shrugged. "It'll pass, Emily. I've been smoking for decades. It's probably just the effects of all those years of cigarettes. I'm not getting any younger, but it's nothing to worry about." But Emily wouldn't let it go. She had seen enough to know that chronic coughing, especially with mucus, wasn't something to ignore, particularly in someone who had a history of smoking. She insisted that he make an appointment with his doctor. At first, John resisted, but after much persuasion, he agreed to go. He didn't want to worry Emily, but deep down, he knew she was right. Something wasn't right, and maybe it was time to face it. A few days later, John sat in the doctor's office, his arms folded across his chest, still feeling uneasy about what might lie ahead. Dr. Lewis, his physician for the past 15 years, was a straightforward woman who didn't sugarcoat things. She had always been gentle with him, but she wasn't one to mince words when it came to matters of health. "John," Dr. Lewis said, looking at him over the rim of her glasses after listening to his symptoms, "this cough of yours has been going on for a while, and we need to figure out what's causing it. The fact that you're coughing up mucus regularly and feeling short of breath is concerning, especially given your history of smoking." John nodded, but didn't say anything. He had heard enough to know that smoking was a factor in many respiratory problems, and he feared that this might be the beginning of something serious. Dr. Lewis continued, "I want to run a few tests. We'll start with a chest x-ray to check for any damage to your lungs, and we'll also do a pulmonary function test to see how well your lungs are working. I know you've smoked for a long time, and the chances are high that this could be some form of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. It's a common issue for people who have a history of smoking, but we need to be sure." John felt a knot form in his stomach. COPD. He had heard of it before. His friend Jerry had been diagnosed with it years ago. Jerry's condition had worsened over time, and now he needed oxygen just to get through the day. It was a sobering thought, but it wasn't like John hadn't expected it. Smoking had always been a gamble, and maybe his luck had finally run out. Over the next week, John underwent several tests. The chest x-ray confirmed that there were signs of damage in his lungs, some areas of scarring, likely from years of smoking. The pulmonary function test showed a significant decline in his lung capacity, which meant that his lungs were struggling to take in enough air. The results were consistent with COPD, though Dr. Lewis wanted to run a few more tests to rule out other potential conditions. When the diagnosis was confirmed, John felt a mixture of fear and resignation. He had been expecting it, but hearing it from a doctor made it feel all the more real. COPD was a progressive disease, meaning it would only get worse over time. Though it wasn't immediately life-threatening, it could severely impact his quality of life if left untreated. Dr. Lewis explained the next steps. John, I want you to take this seriously. COPD is manageable if we start treatment early, but it's important to act now. I'm going to prescribe a bronchodilator to help open up your airways, and I want you to start pulmonary rehabilitation to improve your lung function. The most important thing, though, is that you quit smoking immediately. If you continue to smoke, your condition will worsen much faster. John knew that quitting smoking would be difficult. It had been a part of his life for over 50 years. But for the first time in a long while, he understood that the stakes were high. His health was at risk, and if he didn't take control now, he might not have much time left to enjoy the things he loved. The weeks following his diagnosis were a blur of appointments and changes. John worked with a smoking cessation counselor to help him quit, though it wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration and doubt, but Emily stood by him every step of the way. She made sure he attended his pulmonary rehabilitation sessions, where he learned how to manage his symptoms and build his strength through breathing exercises and physical activity. Slowly but surely, John began to feel a bit better. His coughing was less frequent, and when it did occur, it wasn't as severe. He noticed that he had more energy and that he could do things that had once left him breathless, like taking short walks around the neighborhood, without feeling like he was suffocating. Though John knew that his condition wouldn't improve overnight, he was grateful for the second chance he had been given. He was learning to manage his COPD, but more importantly, he was learning to respect his body's limitations. Every day without a cigarette was a victory, and every breath he took felt like a small triumph. The diagnosis of COPD had forced John to face the reality of his health, but it had also opened his eyes to the importance of taking care of himself, of listening to his body, and of seeking help when something didn't feel right. For the first time in years, he was starting to think about the future, not just the next few days or weeks, but the long term. As John sat on the porch one evening, his lungs clearer than they had been in months, he felt a sense of peace. He was still here. He was still fighting. And with the support of his family and doctors, he had a chance to live the rest of his life with the dignity and strength he had always prided himself on. Evelyn had always been a gentle soul, a woman who found beauty in the simple things. Her garden of blooming roses, the sound of birds chirping in the morning, and the smell of freshly baked bread. At 80, she was living a peaceful, quiet life in the same little cottage she and her late husband had built decades ago. Their children, now grown, would visit on weekends, bringing with them the energy and joy of grandchildren, and Evelyn would cook large meals, her heart full of pride. It was a life she cherished, one built on love, family, and tradition. But for the past few months, Evelyn had noticed a change in her health that she couldn't ignore. It started subtly, a slight cough, nothing more than an occasional irritation at first. She attributed it to the weather or perhaps a bit of dust from the garden. Evelyn had always been healthy, and while she had mild asthma in her younger years, it had never really been a problem. But soon, the cough didn't feel quite right. It was persistent, and with it came an unsettling sound, wheezing. At first, it was faint, something that she could almost dismiss as a coincidence. But as the days turned into weeks, the wheezing grew louder, more pronounced, until it became a constant companion. The cough had a rhythm to it now, sharp and dry, followed by the wheeze, a high-pitched, almost musical sound that echoed in her chest whenever she exhaled. It was an odd, uncomfortable sensation, and Evelyn found herself more and more short of breath, especially after even the slightest physical exertion. Climbing the stairs to her bedroom left her feeling winded, and on more than one occasion, she found herself sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to catch her breath. Her chest would tighten, and the wheezing would persist, sometimes lasting for hours. At first, Evelyn didn't think much of it. After all, she was 80, and age often brought little aches and pains. She had always taken care of herself, eating healthy, getting plenty of rest, and staying active with her gardening. But the coughing, the wheezing, and the difficulty breathing were becoming harder to ignore. She tried to chalk it up to her past asthma, believing it was just a flare-up. Maybe the dust from the garden or the dry air had triggered something. But deep down, she knew something was different this time. Her daughter, Carla, who had been living in a nearby town, visited frequently to check in on her mother. One afternoon, after finding Evelyn sitting on the couch, breathing heavily, Carla grew concerned. "Mom, you're not looking too well," she said, sitting beside her and taking her mother's hand. "That cough of yours, it's not just a cold, is it?" Evelyn smiled weakly. "Oh, it's nothing, Carla. Just a little cough. With all the pollen in the air and my asthma from when I was younger, it's probably just that. I'll be fine, dear." But Carla wasn't convinced. She could hear the wheeze in her mother's voice and saw the strain on Evelyn's face. It wasn't the same light, casual cough her mother had always had during allergy seasons. There was something more to it now, something that Evelyn couldn't brush off. "I don't think this is just asthma, Mom. I think it's time to see a doctor." Evelyn hesitated. "I don't want to bother them, Carla. I'm sure it will go away on its own." Keine Zeit. She knew her mother well enough to understand that Evelyn had a tendency to downplay her health issues. "Mom, you're 80 now. We can't take chances. Let's just get it checked out, for peace of mind if nothing else. Please?" Reluctantly, Evelyn agreed, and the next day they made an appointment with Dr. Phillips, a kind-hearted pulmonologist whom Carla had recommended. Dr. Phillips had been seeing Evelyn's family for years, and she was the type of doctor who took the time to listen, never rushing her patients through an appointment. When they arrived at the clinic, Evelyn felt a mix of apprehension and relief. Maybe it was time to face whatever was going on with her body. Dr. Phillips greeted them warmly and led Evelyn to the examination room. She took a careful history, asking about Evelyn's symptoms, her medical history, and her lifestyle. Evelyn explained the persistent cough, the wheezing, and the breathlessness that seemed to worsen as the weeks went by. Dr. Phillips examined Evelyn thoroughly, using her stethoscope to listen to her lungs and asking her to take deep breaths. As Evelyn breathed in and out, the doctor's expression shifted slightly. There was a faint wheeze that Dr. Phillips could hear, but there was something else, something more concerning. "Evelyn, I want to do a few more tests," Dr. Phillips said, her voice steady but serious. "For what I'm hearing and feeling, I suspect that you might have developed a respiratory infection or, possibly, a complication from your asthma. We need to be sure." Evelyn's heart sank. She had lived through so much in her lifetime, loss, hardships, and challenges, but this was different. This wasn't just the occasional flare-up of asthma she had learned to manage over the years. This was something more insidious, and Evelyn couldn't deny the fear creeping into her thoughts. The tests were scheduled for the following week, and in the meantime, Evelyn tried her best to go about her usual routine, though her breathing difficulties made even simple tasks feel monumental. The cough and wheezing were unrelenting, as she found herself taking short, shallow breaths throughout the day. She spent more time resting, sitting on the couch, or reclining in the garden, watching the world go by, but feeling detached from it all. Her energy levels were low, and every activity felt like an ordeal. Finally, the test results came in, and Evelyn returned to Dr. Phillips' office for the follow-up. This time, her daughter Carla accompanied her, a silent reminder that Evelyn wasn't alone in this. Dr. Phillips greeted them, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, she got straight to the point. "Evelyn, I'm afraid that the tests show you've developed a lung infection, possibly triggered by your asthma. But more importantly, it looks like you've developed something called bronchiectasis." Dr. Phillips paused, letting the words settle in before continuing. Bronchiectasis is a chronic condition that causes damage to the airways in the lungs, leading to a buildup of mucus and a persistent cough, often accompanied by wheezing, which is what you've been experiencing. Evelyn blinked, trying to process what the doctor had just said. "Bronchiectasis? Is that serious?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It is a serious condition, but it's manageable," Dr. Phillips reassured her. "Essentially, your airways have become damaged, which makes it harder for mucus to clear out naturally. This results in chronic coughing and wheezing, as you've been experiencing. It's not uncommon in older adults, especially those with a history of asthma or respiratory infections. However, with proper treatment, we can control the symptoms and slow the progression of the disease." Evelyn let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was relieved to know that there was a name for what she had been going through, but she also felt overwhelmed by the realization that her lungs were no longer functioning the way they once had. Dr. Phillips explained the next steps in Evelyn's treatment. First and foremost, we're going to start you on antibiotics to treat the infection. We'll also prescribe a bronchodilator to help open up your airways and make it easier for you to breathe. You'll need to take these medications regularly. And I'd also recommend pulmonary rehabilitation to help improve your lung function and teach you strategies for managing your symptoms. In some cases, if the bronchiectasis becomes more severe, we may need to consider more intensive treatments, but we're not there yet. Evelyn listened carefully, nodding along. There was a lot to take in, but the sense of clarity that came with the diagnosis gave her hope. She could manage this. It wouldn't be easy, but with the right treatment, she could regain control over her health. The next few weeks were a period of adjustment for Evelyn. She followed Dr. Phillips' instructions carefully, taking her medications on time and attending the pulmonary rehabilitation sessions. The exercises helped her manage her breathlessness, and although the cough and wheezing persisted, they were not as severe as they had been before. She found that she was able to do some light gardening again, though she had to pace herself and take frequent breaks. With time, Evelyn grew more comfortable with the changes. She learned to listen to her body and not push herself too hard. She took pride in the fact that she was doing everything she could to care for her lungs, and she was grateful for the support of Carla and her other children, who regularly checked in on her. Though her life had been altered by the diagnosis, Evelyn came to appreciate the importance of taking proactive steps when it came to her health. She no longer took her breathing for granted, and she learned to appreciate the simple act of taking a deep, full breath. It wasn't always easy, but with each passing day, she was stronger and more determined to live the best life she could. As she sat in her garden one evening, the sun setting behind the trees, Evelyn reflected on how far she had come. She was no longer the woman who could work tirelessly for hours without feeling tired, but she was still the woman who could find joy in the small things, like the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves or the sight of a flower blooming in the spring. Even with bronchiectasis, Evelyn had found peace. She was taking control of her health, and for that, she was grateful. Sarah had always been the pillar of her family, the strong, calm presence that her loved ones could always rely on. At 68, she had spent most of her life as a teacher, a mother, and a grandmother. After retiring a few years ago, Sarah filled her days with knitting, reading, and baking, passions that had sustained her for decades. She was the kind of woman who saw beauty in the smallest moments. The warmth of a cup of tea in the morning, the quiet joy of watching her grandchildren play in the yard, the deep satisfaction of finishing a good book. Sarah had a grace about her, a way of making even the simplest tasks feel significant. But now, Sarah was facing a challenge that was testing her strength in ways she hadn't imagined. It began with a persistent dry cough, a small irritation that at first seemed harmless, just a little tickle in her throat. For weeks, Sarah had chalked it up to the dry winter air. The air in her home had always been a bit stuffy during the colder months, especially with the heating running constantly. She had tried to soothe the cough with hot water, honey, and herbal teas, things that had worked for her in the past. But this time, the cough didn't go away. It became worse, and soon it wasn't just a mild annoyance. It was a constant companion, a dry, hacking cough that seemed to grip her chest and throat, leaving her exhausted. The worst part was that no matter how much water or tea she drank, it felt like the cough wouldn't be satisfied. It was dry, unproductive, and relentless. At first, Sarah dismissed it as just one of those things that would pass. She had been through colds and mild flu before, and they always went away in a week or two. But this cough persisted, dragging on for several weeks. It didn't seem to worsen, but it didn't get any better either. Every morning, she woke up with the same scratchy throat, the same dry cough, and as the day went on, she found herself feeling more and more drained. She noticed that when she tried to speak for long periods, her voice became hoarse, and she would start coughing uncontrollably. There were moments when she felt as if she were suffocating, a sensation she hadn't experienced before. Despite her growing discomfort, Sarah didn't want to be a burden. Her daughter, Rebecca, had been visiting more often, especially after Sarah's husband passed away 2 years ago. But Sarah didn't want to worry her. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not needing help. Yet, there was something nagging at her, a quiet voice in her mind telling her that perhaps this cough wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It wasn't just the dry air or a little cold. It felt deeper, more persistent, and something about it made her uneasy. One afternoon, after Sarah had finished a long phone call with her sister, she realized that she could no longer ignore the toll this cough was taking on her. She was winded, her chest was tight, and the dry, hacking cough had become so frequent that it was affecting her ability to do basic tasks. It felt as if her body was trying to tell her something important. She reached for her phone and called Rebecca. "Mom, are you okay?" Rebecca asked when she picked up the phone. There was a note of concern in her voice that Sarah couldn't ignore. "I'm fine, dear," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. "It's just this cough. It's been bothering me for a while now, but I'm sure it's nothing." Rebecca, however, was not convinced. "Mom, this doesn't sound like nothing. You've been coughing for weeks. I think you should go see a doctor." Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to seem weak or needy. But the truth was Rebecca was right. She had been putting it off for far too long. "All right, I'll make an appointment," she said, knowing it was the right thing to do. The next day, Sarah visited her primary care doctor, Dr. Martinez, who had been her physician for years. Dr. Martinez was a no-nonsense doctor, but she had always been kind and attentive to Sarah. After listening to Sarah's concerns, Dr. Martinez agreed that the persistent dry cough needed to be investigated further. She performed a thorough examination, listening to Sarah's lungs and checking for any signs of infection or other abnormalities. "There's no sign of infection, but the cough is concerning," Dr. Martinez said after the examination. "I want to run some tests to rule out a few conditions. It could be something as simple as postnasal drip, or it could be something more serious like acid reflux or even asthma. I'll order a chest x-ray and a few other tests to get a clearer picture." Sarah nodded, trying to remain calm. She had heard of people having all sorts of symptoms that turn out to be nothing serious, but a part of her was still worried. She was aware that with age, things didn't always work the way they used to. The thought of her body failing her, of facing something that might not be fixable, gnawed at her. Over the next few days, Sarah underwent the necessary tests. She had the chest x-ray, which came back clear, and she also did a breathing test to rule out asthma. The results were inconclusive, but Dr. Martinez wasn't satisfied yet. She recommended a few more specialized tests to check for conditions like lung fibrosis or even lung cancer, though she was careful not to alarm Sarah unnecessarily. A week later, the results came in. Dr. Martinez's office called Sarah to schedule a follow-up appointment. When Sarah walked into the office, she was immediately struck by the somber tone in Dr. Martinez's voice. "Sarah, I'm afraid the tests show some signs of interstitial lung disease," Dr. Martinez said, looking over the results. "It's a group of disorders that cause inflammation and scarring of the lung tissue. The dry cough you've been experiencing is one of the primary symptoms, but it can also cause shortness of breath, fatigue, and a feeling of tightness in the chest." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the information. Interstitial lung disease sounded frightening, and the mention of scarring in the lungs sent a chill down her spine. She had always been so careful with her health, so active and engaged, but now the reality of aging and its toll on the body was staring her in the face. Dr. Martinez continued, "I want to be clear that interstitial lung disease is a progressive condition, but it varies from person to person. In some cases, it can be managed with medications to reduce inflammation and slow the progression of the disease. In others, the disease may progress more rapidly. We will need to monitor your condition closely and see how you respond to treatment." Sarah sat there, taking in the news. It felt surreal. A persistent dry cough was one thing, but now she was facing something much more serious. She wasn't sure what to think, how to feel. The idea that her body, which had served her so well for nearly 7 decades, was betraying her was hard to accept. "I understand this news is difficult," Dr. Martinez said gently. "But we will do everything we can to help you manage your symptoms and maintain your quality of life. I'm recommending a referral to a pulmonologist who specializes in lung diseases for further evaluation and treatment. We will also begin a treatment plan right away to help you manage the symptoms." Sarah nodded, her mind still in a fog. She knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew that she had a choice. She could either let this disease define her and retreat from the world, or she could face it head-on, with the same determination and strength that had carried her through every challenge in her life. Over the following weeks, Sarah began her treatment plan. She met with the pulmonologist, who explained more about interstitial lung disease and how it could affect her lungs. The doctor prescribed anti-inflammatory medications to help reduce the scarring and inflammation in her lungs, and she was enrolled in pulmonary rehabilitation, which helped her improve her lung function and breathing. The road was long and filled with challenges, but Sarah found herself adapting. She had to be careful about overexerting herself, but she continued to stay active, finding joy in the small things: gardening, knitting, spending time with her grandchildren. Her cough persisted, but with the right medication, it became more manageable. She learned to breathe slowly, deliberately, and to rest when her body needed it. Rebecca and the rest of the family were a constant support. They helped her with errands, attended doctor's appointments with her, and made sure she wasn't alone in facing this new chapter of her life. Sarah was determined not to let her diagnosis control her. She knew that interstitial lung disease was a serious condition, but she refused to let it define her. As Sarah sat at her garden one afternoon, watching the sun set over the horizon, she realized something important. Life had never been easy. There had always been obstacles, challenges, and hardships. But Sarah had never let them stop her. She had always found a way to move forward, to find strength in the face of adversity. And now, with the support of her family and a treatment plan in place, she would do the same. The persistent dry cough was a reminder of her vulnerability, but it was also a reminder of her resilience. She was still here, still fighting, and she was going to keep living her life to the fullest. She would no longer take her health for granted, but she would also never let it take away her spirit. There was still so much beauty in the world, so much love to give, and Sarah intended to savor every moment, no matter what challenges lay ahead.